What's up, ladies and gentlemen? How's it going? It's Dan here from Cryonoir. So today we are doing another one of my retro collection videos where I just go through various different things for my collection. That's because there's been very little in the way of development going, so a devlog would be nothing. So hence we're doing this. It also gives me an opportunity to test out my new mic arm, which I've got going on and stuff. So this is all cool. This is all just something I wanted to do anyway. So let's get on with it. Today we're going to be talking about my Atari collection. It's quite small, so I'm going to be covering two consoles in this video, which is good. I do like Atari, but they're not really high on my list, but they are very important, so they should be talked about, and definitely something worth collecting as well. First up, we have the Atari 2600. This was definitely during their spaceship phase, it has to be said. This is a very cool looking piece of equipment. Now, this is a Mark III, also known as a Junior. So, what happened was, in 1977, they released the original Atari 2600, which is known as the Woody, and that has like a wood panel on the front, which looks absolutely amazing. And then in 1982, they released a second iteration, which is exactly the same internally. It was black, it was more sleek, it was more modern, and that was nicknamed the Vader. That's my personal favourite. I think that one looks amazing. Apparently, it's everybody else's personal favourite because it's worth a lot more than the Woody. And then later on in 1986, they relaunched this version, which is called the Junior. Internally, they're all exactly the same, and they all basically perform the same functions. They're all backwards compatible. They're just slightly different designs. I don't even think they're skimped on any of them either. I don't think there's any sort of difference in sort of internals or hardware or anything. They're all pretty much of a muchness. There was also differences in the switches that you would get on the top. Like, they did either a 4-switch or a 6-switch. I must learn to count. They did a 4-switch or a 6-switch. There we go. Well done. Sesame Street was paying off. So this one here is like a 4-switch. Well, this is actually, it has all the functionality of a 6-switch, but it just has the 4 main switches on the front and then 2 at the back there as well. They did like mostly fairly things you would expect, such as like on, off, and reset. But they also had a couple of other quirks in there as well. Like one of the switches was for difficulty, so you could set it to your games like slightly harder or slightly easier rather than doing it within the menus. One was to switch between sort of different controller ports, or I think also to set it up as 2-player. You add functionality so that was done with the switches. And then the other one, which is a really cool one, which is on this it actually has different setting for a colour or a black and white TV, because back then it was quite possible that people would have black and white TVs and not just automatically assume they have colour. The Atari 2600 ran up until 1992, and in its lifespan it sold 30 million consoles, which makes it a huge seller. It was a really big powerhouse. Not as big as the NES and things like that, but it was certainly one of the most successful consoles of all time. And it also has a bit of a stigma with it as well, to do with the whole E.T. kind of games crash debacle and stuff, which again I think is slightly unfair, and it's sort of overblown a little bit. Certainly the E.T. connection. E.T. was just one of the games that sucked, but it was a very high-profile game. And also, it was definitely more of a North American thing. It did have a bit of an effect in Japan. It had next to no effect here in the UK. And for a lot of Europe, we didn't even really notice. It was just, Atari's dead, never mind, carry on with, Sinclair and Commodore and everyone else. It was not such a big deal over here. And one very important thing was the cartridge here. Now, this was one of the first, if not the first, console to ever have interchangeable cartridges, so you just buy the console and you get new games that you then plug in, which we take for granted now. I mean, it's old hat now because everyone most games are sort of either digital distribution or by disc. But previous to that, it was cartridges. Previous to that, it was sort of floppy disks, either sort of 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch floppy disks. Or some consoles actually just had the games built in. So much like the kind of plug-and-play TV things you get now, only they would have like 1 or 2 games, or sometimes maybe even as many as 6. But that was it, and they were just built in, and you couldn't change them, and that was that. You bought the console, you got the 6 games, and there you go. This is one of the first ones, if not the first. I'm pretty sure it's the first, but I don't want to say for definite because I don't want to lie to you and be wrong. But I'm pretty sure it's the first that came with an interchangeable cartridge, so you could just swap in and out of cartridges and just put in brand new games. It also has these like little ports at the back for controllers, so you could change and put different controllers on, which is again something that's not very common. And this controller port design here, I don't know if you can see this. This was used by Atari, but it was also used exactly the same was used by Atari, but it was also used by Commodore. It was also used by Sega as well. So you could plug Sega Mega Drive control ports into this, and they'll work perfectly fine. So it's really crazy that something that was released in 1977 would take the same controller port of a console that wasn't released till the early 90s. You know what I mean? Like 20 years later. It's crazy. But yeah, it's exactly the same, and they'll work identical in there. The controllers for this are now getting really expensive. The ones that people really want is the single button, the sort of iconic one. I don't know if it's got a special name, but they're really iconic. I haven't got one of those, but those are the ones that everyone wants, and they're a little bit on the kind of breakable side, so they're getting quite rare. Now the 2600's like library of games was huge. It had absolutely loads and loads of games, but more importantly the games were actually really visually quite good, particularly when you compare them to what was around about that sort of time. Sort of the Spectrum was one that really springs to mind, and also the ColecoVision and the Intellivision and all that kind of stuff. If you compare the graphics for them to the 2600, it really was a very competitive machine, and it was very high up there. And what with the interchangeable cartridges, that meant that you had zero load time, or next to no load time, whereas things like the ZX Spectrum used tape, and that would take chuffing forever to load, absolutely forever. And same with things like the BBC micros and all of that kind of stuff. They, using the discs would take a lot longer to load than cartridge. So that was like a real big plus for it. Now I only have 4 games in total. I have 2 that are unboxed. I just have Ms. Pac-Man, which is supposedly the best version of Pac-Man on the system, which is very, very cool. The original Pac-Man's not great, but it's not as bad as people make out, or so I've been led to believe. And I also have Space Invaders, which is it's just Space Invaders, basically. This actually came with like a printed cover. They used to do a lot of them which just had writing on them. But this comes with joystick controller support, which is good. When they came boxed, they used to come like this, basically, which is like a cardboard sleeve, and inside there you get like a groovy sort of plastic pull-out, and which is really flimsy. And then again you get the cartridge on there. Some of them, there was no real kind of standard for the cartridges. Like this one has like a little tab at the bottom that I don't know if you'll be able to see that. I'll try and get that. There we go. And you can like hold it by that. And some of them looked completely different again. But they all work perfectly the same. So this one's called Star Voyager. This looks to be kind of like a faux sort of on board view flying around. Again, I don't know if that's any good, so if anyone out there can tell me that's a good game or not, I don't know. But yeah, I mean the packaging was pretty cool. I quite like this kind of this is proper 70s packaging is this. I got another one which is slightly beat up, which is called Street Racer, and the cover makes it look amazing, loads of cars and like stuff like that in a very sort of 70s way, and motorbikes as well, and loads of cool tracer effects. But when you actually look at what it is, it's just like little blocks popping, but that's what you got for the Atari. And like I say, back then that was a big deal. This one doesn't have like any interesting interior, but this one, are you seeing again? This is a cartridge. It seems in really good condition. But this one again is more of the traditional style cartridge. But yeah, this one also comes with a manual as well, which is a full colour manual, which is really cool. Like you don't see this kind of stuff anymore. I love these manuals. Absolutely love them. Old. So yeah, that was the Atari 2600. It's a very interesting and cool machine to have. I would like to say this is the oldest machine that I have, but it's not, because the NES came out before this iteration, even though this was like a 1977 design, or internally, and it's a 1977 console. This version is later than my NES, so it's not as old as that, which is, another interesting little cool thing is you put the cartridges in backwards. So like that's the way that the console would fit, and the cartridge goes in like that. When you look at it at the top of the cartridge picture on the back there, and so is the controller port. So I don't know what they were thinking when they did that, but that was the thing that they did. Onto my other piece of hardware. This was a must-have for my collection. I really, really wanted this. Even though there wasn't particularly any games that I definitely wanted for the system, maybe one or two, but I really wanted this console. I quite like, slightly rarer consoles, or even ideally very rare consoles, but they're quite expensive. And out of the rarer consoles, or one of the cheapest ones is this, which is the Atari Jaguar. Now, I absolutely love this machine. I think this is one of the coolest looking designs of any console ever in history. I think it looks absolutely amazing. And I really love the sort of design, the Jaguar logo. That's pretty cool with the slashes. This is an amazing console. Actually, it's not. It's terrible. But no, it could have been an amazing console. It could have been a really, really good console. So this came out in North America in 1993, around about November sort of time, I believe. And then in the July, it landed the following year in 94. It landed in Europe, and then again in November in 94, it landed in Japan. So this was like a really early console from the 32-bit gen, the sort of the PlayStation 1, the Saturn, and the N64. This was like a really early one for that, and it was going to be the mutt's nuts basically. This was off the back of the 16-bit generation, where you had Sega versus Nintendo that were really going great guns at each other. That sort of opened the door to everyone else. That basically showed everyone that you don't have to be called Nintendo to make a profit out of gaming. Atari had obviously been bit quite badly by the games crash, and that kind of warded a lot of other developers and certainly a lot of other hardware manufacturers off. So that's why you ended up with Nintendo ruling the roost. And sort of Sega came in with the Master System around about the 8-bit era and started to make a few waves. And then before the SNES, out came the Mega Drive, and that was that. And that war went on, and that was, to my mind, probably the fiercest fought console war that I can think of, definitely more than anything that came later than that. Maybe potentially the PS3 and 360 one. That was there was a lot of disagreements there. But I think probably the Sega Nintendo one from like the 16-bit generation was the most fiercest fought in every way, shape or form. And after that, everyone jumped on the bandwagon. So you had like Commodore releasing the Amiga CD32, Panasonic releasing the 3DO. You also had the Philips CDI, and the Atari Jaguar, and then you had the PlayStation, the Saturn, and also the N64. So there was a lot of consoles in that time, and they all started coming out. They were sort of drip fed early on, and nobody knew what was gonna be successful. Nobody really knew what was going on. It was the first major steps into potentially making every game like a 3D game, or certainly the bulk of the titles. Up until that point, it'd been sort of played with, but don't forget, like the biggest first-person shooter up to that point really was Doom, and that was still only 2D. Even though it was like a faux 3D, it wasn't proper 3D. But you did have games on consoles like the SNES had Star Fox, which was a 3D game, and there was lots of other stunt race effects, virtual racing, blah blah blah. There was lots, but there was not the kind of the permanence of it, shall we say. The bulk of it was still sprite based 2D games. So everyone was sort of really trying to work out how to do this. There was no real kind of roadmap and no real kind of idea as to how it was going to work. So everyone was just throwing all sorts of little ideas out there. And in amongst all that came Atari with their 64-bit machine, which was cartridge-based. Okay, so this is all a little. This was a little bit odd. It's quite interesting that during that generation there was like everyone was going for 32-bit because that was twice the performance of the previous consoles because they were all 16-bit. So they were doing that, and they all went CD based, like the Saturn, the PlayStation, the Amiga CD, everything 32-bit CD based. But there were two outliers, and that was Nintendo with a cartridge based 64 system called the N64, and Atari with the Jaguar 64, which was also a cartridge based system, which is again a bit odd. So they did, at the time, they intended to release two consoles. There was going to be the Panther, which was a 16-bit machine, which was designed to keep pace with the SNES and the Mega Drive, and then they were also going to release the new console, which was the Jaguar, and that was going to destroy everyone. It was twice as powerful as everything else, so it was going to be the nuts, and they were just going to roll the roost. Unfortunately, it turns out it wasn't right. There's a lot of arguments as to whether or not it is a 64-bit machine or not. And the reason for that is it has two processors in it, a CPU and a GPU, that are both 32-bit. So they're saying, so two 32-bit processors, mush them together, 64-bit, there we go. And that's fine. Now, a lot of people disagreed with that because it didn't have one major 64-bit chipset. It just had two 32-bits. To the extent that a guy from Sega came along and said, well, if you want to do your maths that way, we can do it with the Sega Saturn. And the Sega Saturn's a 112-bit machine. Do you know what I mean? So it was a little ums and ahs, and Atari came back at them and said, yeah, no, but the difference is we're using a 32-bit bus, so therefore the thing a 64-bit bus or something, so therefore it all works perfectly. Anyway, it was ridiculous. The major problem was in the fact that it had these two chips, and it had one 16-bit chip in the center, and these two chips were called Tom and Jerry, and the idea was that the 16-bit chip would work as kind of like a boss, if you know what I mean, and that would divvy out the tasks to the two separate chips, much like how hyperthreading works on modern CPUs. And the idea is that way that does all of the kind of final output, and it uses these two big 32-bit processors as like kind of the major data crunchers. Now the problem with that is that they had really terrible tech support and really terrible documentation when they gave it to publishers and game developers. So game developers found it an utter nightmare to get this to work, and they were always, the two chips were always either competing against each other or they couldn't divvy it up and blah blah blah. So they ended up, a lot of games that were on the system ended up just using the 16-bit CPU that was designed to do all of the major work and leave the two 32-bit chips completely dormant. That meant that it was effectively just a 16-bit machine. It was like a Sega Mega Drive or a Super Nintendo. So because of that, a lot of the games that came out really did not show off that it was a 64-bit machine. They just were not anywhere near up to the standards of even the 32-bit machines that were using dedicated 32-bit CPUs. When you saw sort of screenshots of a lot of these 32-bit consoles during that time, this is sort of the bridge between 16-bit, the death of the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo, and kind of things like the Saturn and the PlayStation and later on the N64 really starting to gear up and to be released and to show off what you can do with 32 bits. There were these like kind of middle runners that kind of were sort of sacrificed, like things like the Jaguar and the Amiga CD. You sort of look at them, and 32-bit consoles, that's fine, but the actual step from the 16-bit is not that much, and that was because a lot of the stuff they were doing were porting, particularly for the Amiga and for Atari, they were porting stuff over from 16-bit consoles, and that's why the only game I actually have for the Jaguar, I only have one, and that's Dragon, which was available on both the Mega Drive and on the Super Nintendo, and it's a faithful port, but you would expect it, considering it's supposed to have nearly 4 times the amount of horsepower. You would suppose it would be able to manage it. It's not special. It's not like it's got loads more effects or anything like that. It's pretty much a 1-for-1 port of a 16-bit game. So it's kind of like when the 360 came out and it's a brand new console, and look at all the horsepower we've got, and here's Halo, and it's like, well, Halo was out on the previous version. And it's not even like a super sampled amazing version of Halo. It's exactly the same game. So that's why a lot of these consoles during that time died off, because they just ported old stuff over from previous generations onto the new console, expecting people to then shell out for this new console and then just buy back all the games that they either already had or had already played, and then made them, or particularly with the Atari, made them really difficult to make new games. I don't think there is any game on the market for the Atari that actually pushes the Jaguar to what it could do. I think there's been some recent sort of homebrew stuff which is starting to look pretty cool, but it was actually a really powerful system. I'm not saying it was as powerful as the N64, but I honestly think it would certainly match either the Sega Saturn or the PlayStation. Maybe not in 3D, because although I don't know, it could do. Yeah, it potentially could. It potentially could be as powerful as a PlayStation 1, and maybe even knocking on the door of an N64. It really was a fairly powerful system, but because it was so badly designed, and there was absolutely no help for developers, everything that came out looks terrible. So, I mean, the games to get for it are Alien vs Predator, and the version of Doom on the Atari Jaguar was a really good version of Doom. But that's about it, really. There's nothing that's spectacularly amazing. Everyone goes on about Tempest 2000 being an amazing game, and it looks alright. To me, it just looks like a game that could have been out on the Vectrex, only in colour. So, there's nothing really that sort of a standout that I would say, oh, this is an amazing game, definitely worth every single penny. However, I really did want to own an Atari Jaguar, just because it was a complete failure. In the same way that I still want to own all of the other crazy consoles that were out in that time, because growing up, I can remember this coming out, and we didn't know that it was going to suck. We didn't know that. We'd gone from, there was like, I was part of that hype cycle, do you know what I mean? I'd been playing on the Sega Mega Drive, and friends had the Super Nintendo, and magazines were filled with, the Amiga CD and the Atari Jaguar, and it was 64 bits, and it was going to be, what it wasn't going to do for the gaming industry. And then, whispers of a PlayStation by Sony and all this kind of stuff. So I really wanted this because, back in the day, I probably would have bought this if I'd have had the money. I would have actually plumped for the Atari Jaguar, I think. Either that or the Sega Saturn, they would have been the ones that I would have bought at the time. But, there we go. Your lessons learned. At the time we didn't know. It was only years down the road as it went that we got to find out what was going to be good. There was an add-on to try and extend this life, which was the Atari CD, which looks like a toilet and is apparently notoriously bad for breakages. But other than that, it was kind of came a bit of a whimper and sort of was pretty much the death of Atari. But yeah, I like it. It's a good little console. The patent for the a little known fact, actually, well, it's quite well known on the internet, but the patent for this actual design got sold and transferred around here and there, and I believe it ended up being sold to a company that manufactures dental equipment. So if you go to certain places in America, you can see what look like Atari Jaguars stuck to the wall, exactly the same shape. They've got like hoses off and stuff like that, and it's got the dental machinery, which is quite cool. I really want one of those as well. So that's the Atari Jaguar. So that's my collection. I have like 4 games for the 2600 and 1 game for the Jaguar, and that's it. I will build on that, but they're not really my major focus at the moment. Particularly the Jaguar, I'll definitely get some more stuff for that. But yeah, so that's my Atari stuff. I hope you enjoyed the video. I will be doing maybe another one of these later down the line because I still have other consoles to go over. There will be some devlogs coming up soon as well. So thank you very much for watching. Oh, I uploaded a Fortnite video. Check that out. Fortnite's really good. Take it easy, guys. I'll see you very soon. See you later. Bye-bye.